The word of the Lord. We're going through each week our vision statement for this particular community, and we're tackling each week just a portion of it with the idea of understanding what these words that were on our vision statement mean, and basically what we are going to strive to be as a community together. And we've been taking it piece by piece. This week we go to the two words called international community. Now, I know if I say international community, it sounds very self-explanatory. Yes, we're a group of people who get together from all different countries around the world. And that would be the end of the sermon, and we could all go home. But in fact, being an international community, looking at the story of Ruth as an international community, gives us a radically new way to think about what does it mean to be an international community together. What does it mean to be a community of God? When we say this word, what are we looking at? And this is why I chose the story of Ruth, because in the story of Ruth, she gives this beautiful picture. It's a great story. It's only 4 chapters. You should read the rest of the book. We'll talk a little bit about it. But throughout it, Ruth and Naomi form a beautiful international community. And I want to look at that today because here's the thing. The way you and I do community most of the time, when we say we're a church community, if we're honest, let's not pretend, our church community is more often flawed and broken because we have conflict with one another, especially in the church. Okay? Let's be real honest here. Now, here's the problem with church community when you have conflict. You've heard me talk about my past experiences in business, and I've worked for some really crazy people. I'm saying really crazy, frustrating people. I've worked with them and for them. I've worked with some people who I just could never stand or tolerate, some people who frustrated me, who bothered me. But you know that at the end of the day, when I left my office, I went home, and I had my wife or my family, and I could, as most guys do, compartmentalize. I put it in a compartment, and I was able to close the door on those people and say, well, that's my work community, but I can close the door, I can go home, turn on the TV, veg out a little bit, and get away from it. Now, but the problem here is that when you and I are going to do community in this church, in this ministry right here, we don't have that luxury so much. When you and I have conflict with one another, it spoils over into our personal lives because we're doing church together. We're living and sharing our lives together. We're praying for one another. You can't simply just go home and close the door. No, if somebody in this room causes you conflict or causes you frustration, you can't just get rid of it. You can't just close the door on it. And so I wanted to look today at what it means that when I say international community, what are we talking about? And I want to use the story of Ruth as an example of this. Now, if you know the story of Ruth here, I'll recap it roughly for you. I'll try to give you a 30-second version of the story of Ruth. We only read a portion of it. Ruth, of course, Naomi loses her husband. She's an Israelite who's now in Moab, and she's lost her husband, she's lost her 2 sons, and she finds herself with 2 daughters-in-law who are Moabites. Now, if you know anything, Moabites and Israelites did not get along with each other. There was extreme racial tension and prejudice between Moabites and Israelites. And so then Naomi says, well, I heard there's food back in Israel, so I'm going to go back to Israel to get the food. Now, the radical thing about this is she has no husband, she has no sons. And in that day and age, that was your wealth. That was your social security program. That was your welfare. And she's without it. So now she looks at Israel and she says, the famine has left the land, so I'm going to go back and get food. She asks her daughters-in-law to come with her, but at the last second, she changes her mind. The reason why she changes her mind is because she knows that if her daughters-in-law, who are Moabites, go back into Israel, they'll be risking their very lives because of the racial tension between Israel and Moab. And so she, as a good mother-in-law, doesn't want to put her daughters-in-law at risk. She says, please stay. And then, of course, we have this passionate discourse between the two, the daughters and them, saying, you know, and at the end, Orpah, of course, kisses her and leaves and goes back. And most pastors say, well, this is because Orpah was selfish and only... No, Orpah was probably doing what anybody would do, any normal person. Ruth, on the other hand, says, no. Where you go, I will go. Your people will be my people. Your God, my God. She converts. This is a conversion. And so, of course, they go to Israel, back to their land, but they're poor. They have no money. They have no wealth. They have no men to take care of them at this time. They're without any means of social security or welfare or protection. And Naomi, of course, says to Ruth, go and glean in the fields. And what she's basically what that means is, as the harvesters went and picked up the crop, whatever fell down behind them, the waste, the poor, the homeless would come and pick it up. And this is a way for the homeless, the poor, to find sustenance, to get support. They didn't get it from the government. They got it from going out and gleaning the fields behind the harvesters. And she says, go and do that. Ruth picks the field of a man named Boaz. And she goes, and Boaz hears about what Ruth has done for her mother-in-law, this extreme sacrifice. And Boaz says, he's amazed at Ruth. The story progresses. He says, you can glean in my fields. And as the story progresses, Ruth, in the middle of the night, goes to him, lays at his feet. She proposes to him. And there's a series of events where Boaz is called her redeemer, kinsman redeemer, meaning he's of the bloodline of Naomi's husband, which means that he has the right to redeem the property, buy back the ancestral land, and then thus restore Naomi and Ruth. And they do that, and then they have a son. Now, what is the point of the story? What is the beauty? What can we learn from Ruth today? From Ruth and Naomi, I think we can learn what it means to be community. And we see that there's three, I'm calling them the 3 C's of community. We see first that in order for us to be a community here, like Ruth and Naomi and then later Boaz are, we have to first have the courage for community. Secondly, we have to have the commitment to community. And then lastly, we have to have compromise within community. We have to have the courage, the commitment, and then also the compromise. What do I mean by courage? Now, how were Naomi and Ruth courageous? Well, I talked a little bit about it. Naomi was extremely courageous here by bringing her daughters-in-law. And do you know why? Because the daughters-in-law at this time, and this was not right, don't get me wrong, I'm not saying this is correct, but the daughters-in-law at this time would have been a burden for her, an economic and a social burden for her. If she brought her daughters-in-law back to her home, she gained nothing. She actually lost. She says, you know, she can't even provide for these 2 people who are going to take food from her. And so she risks. She has the courage enough to risk her standing. And also, if she goes back into Israel and people, her friends, her old friends, remember she's gone about 10, 15 years or so. If her friends see her coming back, they're going to go, who are these 2 Moabite women with you? Why do you have them? Why do you have these, dirty people? Why are they with you? Go take them away. Naomi was risking her status and she was risking her future, but Ruth actually was risking something even more. If you looked in Ruth chapter 2, which we didn't read in chapter 3, there's a part where Boaz, remember, he's the one who owns the field, and he looks at Ruth and he says, you can continue to glean in my fields. Continue to do that because he's found favor with her. But he says, I will tell my men not to harm you. And it's a part that most people pass over in the book. But it's very important to know this. If Ruth, a woman, was out in the fields gleaning, taking this harvest, this waste, since she was a Moabite woman, she would have been subject to all sorts of torture and abuse at the hands of men. Basically, and this is how tragic this is, commentators say that a man at this time, if they saw a Moabite woman in the field, they had the right to do anything they wanted to her. They had the right to do anything that they wanted to her at any time. This is the horrible, life-risking chance that Ruth takes. Going back with Naomi, she knows the Moabites and the Israelites don't go along. She knows she's a racial outsider. She knows that her life's going to be in danger. And yet she does this. Now, how does this relate to you and I? Okay, well, if you and I are going to be an international community, it means this, and I'm not going to belabor this point too long because if you're in this room, you've already taken this step. It means that we have to be courageous enough to interact with one another across racial and social lines, even when, and most often when, it means that we stand to lose something. See, Ruth had nothing to gain by going with Naomi. She had everything to lose. And yet she looked at Naomi, a racial outsider, a foreigner, and she said, I'll risk everything to be a foreigner in your land. And if you find yourself here today from another country, of course, you've kind of already made this step to say, I'll be a foreigner in this land. And you know that coming to even a place like Seoul, which is very highly developed and a modern city, there's risk involved. There's chances that you're taking by just being here alone. But even more so, we have to have courage to take chances with one another. We're at the size right now of 25 to 30 people where you can still get to know every single person in this room. Do you know that? You can still get to know the joys and the sorrows of every single person in this room. But speaking from a former church planner and who did all this research, when you get about 30 to 40 people or more, you start to lose that ability to connect. And so right now in this room, we have this ability, if we look, and last week I made you all look at each other and it was super, super awkward, I know. I'm not going to do that again. But if you were to look at each other, and hopefully you do after the service, you'll see that it takes courage to cross this line, even this aisle. It takes a little courage to talk to somebody who's from a different place other than you. I'm not going to belabor this point because most of you, if you've gone this far, you're right at that doorstep. But this is the courage of Ruth to say, you know what? I'll risk it all. I'll go to a land that doesn't speak the language that I speak or doesn't have the traditions that I have, and I'll risk it. I'll risk my very life. Now, doesn't that make it easier for you to say hi to one another at the end of service? Because you're not risking your life. It's just saying hi. But that's the first thing. You have to have the courage, but more importantly, and this is where I'm going to spend a little time to unpack this second point. Not only do you have to have the courage for community, you have to have the commitment to it. You notice Ruth says, where you go, I will go. And what she's doing there, this is something harder to pick up on in modern times. What she's doing there as a woman, as a Moabite woman to an Israelite woman in ancient times, she's making a covenant. She's making a promise. And she's utterly binding herself to Naomi. This isn't just some casual, well, if you go to Israelite, I'll go there, and if I don't like it and it's not working out, then I can always move back. No. This is a deep and profound covenant bond. This is her looking at Naomi and saying, wherever you go, I will go. Now, what is she doing? She's entering into a friendship. She's entering into a friendship full of sacrifice where she's going to have to take her time and her energy and invest in Naomi, and Naomi's going to have to invest into her. And what does this look like for us? Well, this is going to be a very practical sermon. I'll get more theological at the end maybe. This is going to be very practical. This is the fuel for our starting small groups. Okay, I'm just going to say this. We as a community will never grow unless we have the commitment to one another to share our lives together. And it's going to look and go in the form of small groups. You can call them cell groups or small groups or house churches, whatever word you want to use to describe it. What it's going to look like is this type of commitment, this type of binding to one another. See, Ruth says, wherever you go, I will go. Meaning, she says, I'm going to put you in my calendar. I'm going to take time for you. You want to meet Friday nights in an apartment? Okay, let's do it. That's what Ruth is saying to Naomi. She's saying, I bind myself to you. And so for us in this ministry, this is why we're praying about small groups right now. We're praying about starting one. And to be very, very practical, my preference, my vision is to start one first north of the river, either in this neighborhood or Yongsan, in this north of the river first, and then eventually south of the river and expand from there. But the idea here is that our small group ministry, our small groups, are going to be this type of radical commitment to one another where we take time during the week. I know, we're all busy. That scares some of us. We take time and we get together and we join together and we basically look at each other and we say, where you go, I will go. If you go to that place, I will go there and I will have a relationship with you. Now, why is this important? Because of this. And coming from a guy who preaches every week, I'm going to admit, Sermons don't really change people. I mean, they help you sometimes. They bump you a little bit. They give you some theological insight to some issues. Hopefully, I give you some theological insight to some issues in my sermons. But if you think about what's really changed you in your life as a Christian, or what's changed you in your life in general, it's always relationships. It's always somebody looking at you and saying, where you go, I will go. It's somebody who takes time for you. It's somebody who sacrifices for you. Do you notice Ruth converts in this story? I told you she converts. She says, your God, I want your God, she says to Naomi. Why did she convert? Did she convert because Naomi gave her a good sermon? No. Did she convert because Naomi led a great praise time? No. Did she convert because Naomi gave her a great book about God and it convinced her and Ruth said, oh, now I get it. Okay, now I want your God. No. Ruth converted. Ruth was changed because she saw the commitment that Naomi had for her first. She saw this woman, this old woman with nothing left in her life, willing to say, I will take you on, even though you're a burden, even though you're a social outsider. And Ruth was changed. She was changed by that and that alone. It was no sermon. It wasn't a church program. It wasn't an outreach event. It wasn't a psalm. It wasn't a song. It wasn't anything. It was the thing that changed Ruth, and the thing that's going to change you and I, the thing that's going to grow us together, is if we meet together. If we can look at one another and say, where you go, I will go. If we share our lives together, if we pray with one another. But it doesn't just mean that we have to have the courage for community or the commitment to it. But the last thing, and this is the most difficult, by far and away, this is the most difficult thing for any of us in this room to do. It's going to take compromise. It's going to take compromise in order to have a truly international, life-changing community that looks anything like Ruth and Naomi have. Now, what do we have to compromise? You notice Ruth says, your people will be my people. It's very interesting. What she's doing is she's compromising her culture. She's saying to Naomi, I'm a Moabite. I have a certain culture. I have a certain way of doing things. I eat certain foods. I worship in certain ways. I worship certain gods. And she's saying at this moment, Naomi, because you and I share the same God, I'm willing to give up all of that. Now, this is incredibly difficult for us because everyone in this room, all of us, come from a culture. We all come from a culture. And I'm not just talking about the city or the country that you're from, although that's part of your culture. Even within Seoul, if you're a native Korean, you have a distinct culture unto yourself. And I've used this illustration way too many times, so this is the last time I'm going to use it, and then it's going on the shelf for about a year. I promise you, it's on tape, so if I break this promise to you, then you can hold me accountable. But it sums it up. One of my seminary professors always said, ask a fish to tell you about water, and they'll go, what's water? He says, that's how culture is. It's all around you. You can't define it. You can't even hardly identify where your culture ends and where another person's culture begins. We're all fish. We can't talk about the water. We can no more than we can talk about our culture. Now, that illustration is going on the shelf. I promise you I won't use it for a year. But let me give you another illustration of this. If you want to know, if you want to identify your culture, I'm going to put myself on the chopping block, okay? I'm going to put myself out there. All you have to do is ask yourself this. How is Pastor Allen or Pastor Eric, is he doing a good job? Okay? Now, if you don't, please don't tell me the answer. Not all at once, at least. Maybe one at a time, and only if it's really nice, okay? Just be nice. But think about it in your head. If I ask you the question, am I doing a good job? You're going to answer that question inevitably out of your own culture. What we think of a pastor's responsibilities, and again, I'm using myself as an example, but you can use any other example you want. But how we judge and evaluate things comes solely out of our culture. We're so steeped in it that if we look at somebody and we place a value or a judgment on them and we say, wow, why are they doing that way? Why aren't they doing it this way? Immediately we're able to see that that's where our culture is defining and valuing the other person. And so, for example, if you say, again, I'm putting myself on the chopping block here to use myself as an example, but if you say, well, I think Pastor Allen's doing a great job, and I say, why? And he says, well, he gives these great sermons. Well, that's because your culture says that pastors have to give good sermons. Or if you say, well, I think he's doing a good job because, you know, he prays all the time and he works all these long hours and everything like that, then that's because your culture says that that's the role of a pastor. And again, I'm just using myself as an example. Fill in the blank with you can fill in the blank with yourself. What this says is basically this. Our culture defines and values the things around us, and in order for us to have community where we sacrifice for one another, if we hold on to our culture and put it over and against God and other people, we will never have what Ruth and Naomi had. Because Ruth is able to look at Naomi and say, I know I'm a Moabite. I know that's my culture. But at this moment, I'm willing to give all of that up for you. Ruth takes her culture and she puts it under the God of the Bible. And she says, I'm going to let God speak to my culture rather than my culture speak to God. And brothers and sisters, if we're ever as an international community going to look anything like Ruth and Naomi, this is what we have to do. We have to be able to identify the water that we're swimming in. And we have to be able to say, you know what, that's my culture, but I can push that aside for now. And instead I can subjugate myself, I can sacrifice myself for you, for another person. Ruth gives up her culture for the culture of Yahweh. She doesn't do it to become an Israelite. She's not immigrating to become an Israelite. You notice that. She doesn't just say that your people will be my people. She says, no, your God will be my God. So I'll take everything that I've ever known about my life and I'll put it under the microscope of God. So in order to have this radical community, we need to be courageous, we need to be committed, and we need to be compromising. We need to be able to give up a little bit of ourselves. Now let's pray. No, it's too difficult. You didn't think I was going to end the sermon like that. Come on. This is hard. This is almost impossible. Can you be Ruth? I have a hard time being Ruth. I'm an American, and I'm going to do things in a very American way because I don't know any better, but I'm trying to learn. How can I be a Ruth? How can you be a Ruth? You have to look at the end of the book of Ruth, chapter 4. They give a genealogy at the end. Why would they do that? Because the author of Ruth is trying to point you to something that's greater than Ruth. It says that Ruth and Boaz, remember Boaz offers to marry her and he redeems her. And he brings this Moabite woman into his family and he marries her and they have a child. Their child is Obed, and Obed was the father of Jesse, and Jesse was the father of David. And who did David point to? David pointed to the one who would show a greater compromise, a greater commitment, and a greater courage than Ruth could have ever shown. Ruth, she was radically sacrificial in her community, but she pointed to one person who would do so much more. She pointed to Jesus, and Jesus shows us somebody who's willing to come out of his culture, who's courageous enough to die on a cross, who's committed enough to do it for you and me, and who compromised everything for us. C.S. Lewis talks about the incarnation, which I read in John, the book of 1, and he wrestled with it his whole life. He said imagine that you would become like a cucumber or a slug. Now I'm going to go one step further. If you're in my car with our daughter, you know that the B movie, Jerry Seinfeld's B movie cartoon, is on an endless loop because my daughter she can't go 2 meters in the car without watching that movie. So I've memorized almost every line from that movie. There's one interesting part where the bee, who's played by Jerry Seinfeld, he's on a quest to get back the honey from all the humans that have taken all the honey. I'm not going to bore you with the plot. But, great movie, by the way, good movie. So there's a point where he's the bee, and he's about to go find where the honey is so he can track it down and get all of it back. And he runs into a mosquito. And the mosquito is played by Chris Rock, and the mosquito is kind of a funny character. But they have this interchange where they're on the ride to find the honey. And he looks at, they're talking about community of all things. And the bee, Jerry Seinfeld, says, yeah, we're a tight-knit community, us bees, because we're all crammed in there, We're really tight-knit. And the mosquito, played by Chris Rock, looks at him and says, yeah, you bees, you have a good community. You're all tight-knit. And he looks at the mosquito and says, well, what about you guys? And the mosquito says, no, man, mosquitoes, we're all on our own. He says, why? Because nobody likes us. Everybody's trying to swat us all the time. I hate the mosquito here. They try to swat you here. He said, it's every mosquito for himself. And then the bee says, well, what do you do when you're in trouble? And the mosquito says, trouble? We're always in trouble. Everyone's always trying to kill us. Now, C.S. Lewis says, think about the incarnation of you becoming a cucumber or a slug. Think about you becoming a mosquito. I know it sounds a little silly at first. But think about you transforming yourself into a mosquito and being at the utter wrath of every person who comes into an encounter with you. Everyone's always swatting at you. Everyone's always trying to crush you. Everyone's always trying to kill you. And through Jesus, we see the Lord of the universe become a mosquito. He became something so small and infinitesimal that it could be crushed. And he was crushed. He was crushed for you and I. He compromised everything to become this little, insignificant human flesh thing that was killable and crushable. And because he did that, you and I have the ability now to let go of our culture, to let go of anything that holds us back from being in deep, enriching community with one another. This was what Ruth did. Ruth said, I give it all up for you, Naomi. How do you get to be a Ruth? I know that I talk about the gospel. Let me pause for a second. I know every week you guys come here and I talk about the gospel. Gospel this, gospel that. I always end with about 10 to 15 minutes of how the gospel should change you and how if you really know that somebody died for you, that's going to change you radically. Let me tell you this. If that's not the central reality for you, if you don't know and if you don't wake up every day meditating on the fact that Jesus became this mosquito and was crushed for you, that he died for you, and as John says, he came into a world that should have known him. He came in as an immigrant, as a foreigner, and he was ridiculed, he was mocked, and he was beaten, and he was destroyed, and he was crushed on the cross. If you know that and that alone will change you. But I'm going to be very bold here. If you and I are in this community and we battle over church politics, it means we haven't understood the gospel. If we battle over conflict with one another and we're unable to compromise, if we're unable to show commitment, it means we don't get the gospel. If we are unable to be a Ruth, it means we don't get it. It means the gospel is not really, really real to us. And you know what you get as a result of this? If we are like Ruth, because Jesus was the ultimate Ruth, if you and I take that up as a banner, and if we're courageous enough to do that, and if we're committed enough to one another, and if we're able to compromise for another in our cultural values, you know what we get? At the end of Ruth, it's beautiful because at the end, there's this brand new community which turns the world up on its head. For anybody who tells you that the Old Testament is ancient and outdated, take them to the book of Ruth. Because you know what happens? The Messiah of the world, the Savior of the entire world, comes out of an interracial marriage. That's not traditional values. Traditional value says that the marriage should be between the same race. The book of Ruth says no. The Messiah, the very Savior of the world, comes out of an interracial, life-changing community and marriage. And it shows you that Ruth is actually the true redeemer of Naomi, this woman, this outsider, that traditional values would have looked at her and said she's worth nothing. She's the redeemer in the story. Sure, Boaz redeems her, but do you know what they say at the end of the story to Naomi? They look at Naomi and say, Ruth is more valuable than 7 sons. And if you have a son and a daughter, maybe you feel that way, that the daughter's more valuable than the sons. But that would have been scandalous at the time. Sons were always more valuable than daughters, any way you looked at it, especially 7 sons, which was the perfect number. See, here's the point. If you and I can look at one another and become a Ruth for one another, we will get this type of community that the world looks at and says, wow, this is so